Ac yna dyma Gwydion yn dal I fyny â hi, a dyma fo'n dweud wrth I hi, laddau mohono ti. Mi wna I rhywbeth gwaith I ti, sef, meddai, gadael I ti fynd ar ffurf aderyn. Ac mi fydd yna elyniaeth rhwng o ti a'r holl adar. Ac fe fydd un ail natur iddyn nhw ymosod arno ti, a dy gywilyddio di ple bynnag y don nhw ar dy draws di. O cholli di mod enw, mi gei di dy alw am byth yn blodeuwydd. I'm Phillip Madoc. Merthyr Tydfil is my town, and this flamboyant building, a monument to a rich man's vanity, was my school, and a pretty good school it was. It was built in 1825 as a mansion for one of Merthyr's most powerful families, but in 1910 it was converted into a school and a museum. Cyfarthfa Castle is one of the few remaining symbols of the remarkable history of this town. Most of the tangible relics of its industrial heritage have been buried beneath the paths of progress, and the few that survive give little hint of the kind of place Merthyr must have been in its heyday. These modern factory units have been built on the site of one of the massive dark satanic mills which thrived by feeding the demands of the great boom in railway construction around the middle of the 19th century. There was a story told when I was young of a Merthyr soldier fighting abroad who was flung across a railway line by the blast from a grenade. When he opened his eyes, he saw stamped on the rail the word Dowlais, the trademark of a Merthyr company. I was told it happened in France in World War II. Or was it Germany? Or even Burma? Rails made in Merthyr Tydfil went all over the world. But even in those days, it was hard to believe that Merthyr had been one of the most important towns on earth. 100 years ago, Merthyr Tydfil was an industrial giant. The reason was iron, the most widely used metal known to man. In steel, in alloys, iron is all around us. Whatever distance you traveled, iron transport systems brought you to Merthyr Tydfil. Iron was the backbone of the Industrial Revolution, which started in Britain and is still spreading. And for almost a century, Merthyr Tydfil was the most important iron town on earth. Wherever you come from, you owe a debt to the extraordinary history of this town. Man has been making iron in small quantities for around 4,000 years. This is the site of a tiny furnace on the hillside above Merthyr. It was the kind of furnace that early man used, but this one is thought to date from Roman times. Large-scale production only really started around 600 years ago, when the Belgians invented the blast furnace. Iron ore, a mixture of iron oxide and soil, is heated in a blast of air with carbon and lime. The carbon unites with oxygen in the oxide. Lime mixes with the soil to form slag, and molten iron can be tapped from the bottom. Britain's first blast furnaces were built in Sussex and Surrey. The carbon came from charcoal, using freshly felled trees. The blast came from bellows powered by water wheels. But wood was scarce. The Navy needed it to build ships. During Tudor times, felling trees in the southeast was restricted by royal command, and ironmasters moved west and north. And Merthyr's first blast furnace dates from 1555. But the furnaces consumed such quantities of valuable timber that Britain was forced to import most of its iron from Sweden and Russia. Of course, there was plenty of coal, which is also rich in carbon. But coal contains sulphur, and that makes very bad iron. In 1709 in Shropshire, this man solved the problem. He turned coal to coke, which drove off the sulphur, and found he could smelt good iron. It laid the foundations for a colossal industry. Suddenly at Merthyr Tydfil, everything fell into place. There was iron ore in plenty. Limestone could be quarried on the north side of town. Brickworks at Morriston and Landor made linings for furnaces. Local stone was a good building material. The River Taff, Dowlais Brook and Morlais Brook could drive water wheels. Above all, Merthyr had coal, good coking coal, lots of it, some of it almost on the surface. It was a combination that turned this remote Welsh village into the greatest industrial phenomenon of its day. By 1831, Merthyr Tydfil had a bigger population than Newport, Swansea and Cardiff put together. First Gyfarthfa, then Dowlais became the most important ironworks on earth. Merthyr guns and shot helped win the battles of Trafalgar and Waterloo. Merthyr cables were used on the Menai suspension bridge, and the world's railways ran on rails supplied by the great ironworks of this Welsh town. Merthyr had everything it took to make iron. The problem was transporting finished products away. First, a turnpike road was built. Then, in 1794, the Glamorganshire Canal was opened, 24 miles long with no less than 51 locks. In 1802, the Penydarren tram road was built between Merthyr and Abercynon for horse-drawn trams to carry iron down to the canal. By the 1860s, transport had switched to the railroads. Nobody had ever seen such large-scale industry before. The effect on visitors was devastating.
The traveller, crossing the vast and dreary mountains which enclose the town, lamenting the darkness of the night, suddenly sees the low-hanging clouds divide. The very sky seems on fire. The scene is strange and impressive in broad daylight, but when viewed at night is wild beyond conception. The vivid glow and roaring of the blast furnaces, the clanking of hammers, the confused din of massive machinery. The burning headlands, the coke hearths, now bursting into sheets of flame, now wrapped in vast and impenetrable clouds of smoke.
Turning round a corner at the top of a hill, I saw what appeared to be a glowing mountain in the southeast. I saw enormous furnaces. I saw millions of sparks. I heard all kinds of dreadful sounds. The general effect was stunning.
It is like a vision of hell, and will never leave me, that of these poor creatures toiling all in sweat and dirt amid their furnaces, pits and rolling mills.
Thousands more people came to Merthyr and stayed. There was shocking squalor and hardship in the town. But for hungry farm workers from North and West Wales, from Cumberland, Somerset and Gloucestershire, for Irish and later Jewish immigrants, the high wages paid to iron workers were irresistible. Women and even children worked at the ironworks and down mines. The children not hired direct by the ironmasters, but employed by their parents or organized in teams, and their accounts taken as evidence by the Children's Employment Commission in 1842 paint grim pictures of the conditions they had to endure.
Pan dda'r glo i fyny'r siafft, fe fyddai'n agor y kites a gwthio'r dram at y bad ac arllwys y glo iddo. Mae'n waith caled iawn, ond dydw i ddim yn gyfarwydd ag unrhyw waith arall. gan mod i wedi mynd dan ddeiar yn 7 oed i gadw drysau. Fes i gysgu unwaith wrth wylio'r drysau, a rholio ar y dram. Faeth cert drostau, a thorri'n hoesi. Fe fies i bant o'r gwaith am amser hir.
The commercial success of Merthyr's thriving industrial production created unprecedented employment, but inevitably it also kindled tensions among the majority of the population who were utterly dependent upon the collieries and ironworks. The sordid living conditions were as bad as any in Britain, and riots flared up on 3 occasions in the first half of the 19th century, prompting the establishment of a military garrison in the town to maintain law and order. For a handful, the journey to Merthyr Tydfil meant the opportunity to make immense fortunes. There was Anthony Bacon from Cumberland, who owned Plymouth and Gyfarthfa ironworks. Richard Hill, his brother-in-law, who managed Gyfarthfa and took over Plymouth when Bacon died. Richard Crawshay, Bacon's partner, who ended up with Gyfarthfa and whose family was responsible for building the great castellated mansion which is now home to the fine collection of artifacts that the town has inherited. John Guest, whose name lives on in the vast engineering firm of Guest, Keane and Nettlefolds. He was a brewer, farmer and coal dealer from Staffordshire. He ran Dowlais Furnace and sold the Plymouth lease to Anthony Bacon. Francis Humphrey, who owned a small Staffordshire ironworks, came to help John Guest and ended up with Penydarren. These men shared out Merthyr Tydfil between them and established dynasties. Depending on which piece of land they took, their children and grandchildren became either very rich or fabulously wealthy. Perhaps the greatest ironmaster was John Guest's grandson, Sir John Josiah Guest. Certainly Dowlais was the finest ironworks. It was the first to switch from water to steam-powered bellows, and under Sir John's control, it produced 80% of the valley's iron. It was said that Guest could roll a bar of iron as well as any of his workmen, and cut a trum of coal as well as any collier. Unlike some ironmasters, he kept his forges running when times were hard, stockpiling for better times ahead, and keeping his employees at work. Sir John built a church at Dowlais, and contributed towards schools, a church at Merthyr, and a market house. He founded a savings bank and a workman's library. He was also Merthyr's first MP. He married Lady Charlotte, daughter of the Earl of Lindsay, and she learned Welsh so well that she made a translation of the Mabinogion, the great book of Welsh myths and poetry. One of the men who worked in Merthyr Tydfil was Cornish engineer Richard Trevithick, who came to Penydarren to construct a forge engine and ended up making history. In February 1804, a quarter of a century before Stephenson's rocket, he built a steam railway engine, the first in the world to move along rails under its own power. He did it for a bet, a wager of 1,000 guineas between his employer, Samuel Humphrey, and Richard Crawshay of Gyfarthfa, who didn't believe it could be done. His invention was not followed up, and it was not until 1833 that steam locomotives again operated on the tram road. But Trevithick's route is still walked by railway enthusiasts to commemorate the achievement. It took all these people to build Merthyr Tydfil, and ironically, it took just one to destroy it. Henry Bessemer was an inventor, and the converter named after him turned iron from blast furnaces into steel and revolutionized the industry. Sir John Guest was always keen to develop the latest technology, and these newfangled converters were installed at Dowlais in 1865. He had been the first to learn that ore mined in Merthyr was not suitable for the Bessemer process. In fact, ore reserves were already running out. As early as the 1830s, supplies of ore for Gyfarthfa and Dowlais were brought in from other parts of the country. By the end of the century, 2 tons of Spanish ore were being imported for every ton mined locally. The economics of iron and steel manufacture were changing drastically. Dowlais opened a complete new steelworks near Cardiff docks to process imported ore. Penydarren, undercapitalized and badly managed, was sold to Dowlais in 1859. They closed everything but the coal mines. Next to go was Plymouth. Cyfarthfa was still making steel for shells during the First World War, but in August 1919, its last blast furnace was stopped. For the people of Merthyr, things were very bad indeed. In 1928, an article in the Times described conditions in South Wales.
As the months go by, first boots and clothing wear out, then bedclothes and cooking utensils. Men and women are starving, not starving outright, but gradually wasting away through lack of nourishment.
The main Dowlais works closed in 1930, too vulnerable to withstand the worldwide slump, although the Ivor Works foundry continued to produce ingot molds until, in 1987, the end finally came. Merthyr Tydfil hasn't been the biggest town in Wales since 1880. But anyone tempted to dismiss this place should remember the case of a Mrs. Lewis. In the 18th century, her husband took over Dowlais for £100 a year. She persuaded him the place had no future, and he cancelled the agreement, missing out on the fame and fortune which seemed so unlikely at the time. Welsh poet Danny Apsey wrote, "A place is more than the contours of landscape. It's the people who live there and who have lived there that matter." The people of Merthyr Tydfil have an indomitable spirit. It was forged in the ironworks of Penydarren, Plymouth, Cyfarthfa and Dowlais, and tempered by the decline of one of Britain's greatest industrial towns.